start. These are the 5 key themes that we were provided with from what has been introduced as the knowledge framework for the refugee section. You'll notice that actually asylum seekers and access to Canada in terms of the asylum process is sort of missing from the list. So in terms of the infographic, I sort of used this as an opportunity to illustrate what I think is perhaps the most dramatic and, the sort of something that we need to pay attention to in terms of public policy. Access to asylum appears to be declining rapidly in Canada, and the infographic will show you that between 2012 and 2013, Canadian access to asylum went from 20,500 claims in 2012 to 10,400 claims in 2013, which is a decline of 49%. Just to put that in context, because of the Syrian crisis and what was happening in the rest of the world, asylum claims went up 28% that year, ours went down 49%. So something is going on, so that's just my querying of the 5 questions. I felt that it excluded a few important trends. We talk about in the report the multiple border strategy, which is, I think, part and parcel of a process where the border is pushed out because national security is very important. It's hard to disagree with that. But it is important to realize that if this is a crude instrument and that we're excluding anyone from Somalia or Sri Lanka or Syria who could possibly be a security risk, we also risk excluding refugees, genuine ones, as asylum seekers coming to Canada. So we use the word, or it's actually mine, I want to recognize my other 2 co-authors on this, very important, Sylvia Daddario, Matt Stevens. But this notion of preclusion, I think, is important and kind of salient to our report. So this is kind of the bigger picture. Important to note that government-assisted refugees, while the target remains similar, 7,500 per year, numbers were down to about 75% of that. So government-assisted refugees it's worrisome. We're down at levels as low as they've been in as many as 30 years. So these are important findings. I should be closer to the mic because I've got a froggy voice. Let me just move on to some confirmation of recent findings. An important thing for us to note here, and I'll have to unpack it a little bit, but CIC found in 2010 that basically refugees who came before IRPA, now IRPA changed the law and helped us focus in Canada on protection criteria for selecting refugees. Admissibility criteria like ability to speak English or French, relevant job skills became less important, and protection needs became more important. So you might expect that with that, different caseload of refugees and a lot of group processing from Nepal, Bhutanese refugees, from Thailand, Karen refugees, and so on, people who actually grew up in camps, in fact, might create lower economic performance. But in fact, in 2010, CIC found that there was no major difference in terms of economic productivity once people had been here for a few years, and so on and so forth. So I think that's really, really important. And when I reread the report, I was like, oh, I didn't realize that we had found this. There is an important point to be made about the age of people coming. They're coming younger, so they have less education upon arrival. And now that I've heard Philip's talk, I know that that's a good thing because they'll get Canadian credentials and they'll be much more likely to get a higher paid job and more likely to be employed in the first place. So perhaps that's a good thing. But the punchline here, and it's hard to get at, please don't worry too much about the top part. The top part just says what I did about pre-IRPA people. Refugees coming to Canada were selected on admissibility and how well they're going to do when they get here. Criteria post-IRPA is much more protection focused, albeit with a caveat of admissibility there if exclusion is needed in terms of the discretion of the immigration officers making these decisions. But the last bit is important. The government notices, and I'll just read the last sentence here, that the evaluation says, GAR clients now face more obstacles as demonstrated by the percentage increase in the proportion of refugees, this is post-IRPA refugees, with no official language skills, so that's increased to 14% from pre-IRPA. No formal education, increase of 26% compared with pre-IRPA. And those 65 years or older, so an older group of people coming as well. All of these present different challenges. So what this means, and something that I think the settlement, I'm really honored to have Debbie Douglas here today as one of our discussants, because one of the things the settlement sector has tried for years to do is measure the impact of settlement services. And some of you in the audience I know have struggled with these questions. Methodologically, it's very difficult. But if economic outcomes of refugees after a few years are no different after IRPA as they were before IRPA, and the government tells us that the caseload is there are more obstacles, in their words, to their integration, this means that the settlement agencies must be doing an exemplary job and having a more significant impact than anyone realizes, because there are more challenges documented here at hand. So this is the punchline of the report, but that doesn't seem very punchy, so let me continue with some other bits. All right, so gaps in research. We didn't find any research on what's called the visa office referrals, or the blended visa office referral. This is a group many people may not have heard of. We've got privately sponsored refugees, we've got government-assisted refugees, we've also got BVORs, blended visa office referrals. So we weren't able to comment on this group, still a small group, we would like to know more. We don't know much about the impact of mental and physical disabilities on refugees, or their social and economic integration, so that was a big gap. Little is known about migration pathways for claimants, or why some people abandon their claims. So again, that's hard for us to access. We couldn't find published research on this. The outcomes of Canada's new refugee adjudication process were still very new. The infographic is about all the information we could glean to give you some snapshots of what's happening. More gaps. Data is unavailable on the number of inland refugee claims that preceded the introduction of the Safe Third Country Agreement. And this was brought up in a Harvard study that came out at the end of 2013. Many of you will have come across Arbel, and it's escaping me at the moment, but Efrat Arbel is at UBC in law, looking at the fact that people being picked up for illegal border crossings did increase when the 2004 Safe Third Country came into effect. But we would love to know whether people got through, and whether that policy of the Safe Third Country had the unintended effect of increasing human smuggling across the Canadian-US border. Because that's, of course, there's concern for national security, but there's also concern for the security of people who are forced to smuggle themselves across. Irregular arrivals we weren't able to study because there were none, and that is to say there were none declared by the Public Safety Minister. Irregular arrivals, part of the new legislation that came in at the end of 2012. I think it's important to note that we were asked about irregular migrants, but we were not asked about asylum seekers, and I think this speaks to Audrey Macklin, who will be speaking here this afternoon, if anyone's interested, about the discursive disappearance of the refugee. In our studies in this case, we're supposed to be looking at resettled refugees, but ultimately we should be looking at all refugees, and asylum seekers are not all going to be bona fide refugees, but many will be. So we have to be careful not to just exclude them and treat them as irregular, or, I mean, to me that sort of imputes a sort of illegality before a fair hearing has been held. What questions could we not answer? Let's skip to number 2 there. We were asked, what are the motivations of refugee claimants who come to Canada? And in order to answer that, we thought it would be useful to get some PIFs, or, the new form we thought we might access that, but we were told that that was not the kind of information that would help answer the question. That is to say, asylum seekers' own personal information forms or stories were not what they were looking for. So we were at a loss methodologically as how to answer that question. Question 3 there, what policies are in place to protect against refoulement? Again, a puzzling question, which we queried, because we cite in our report that IRPA provides protection against refoulement. The 1951 Convention provides protection against refoulement. Why we would need additional policies to protect against refoulement seemed a bit of a spurious question, but again, David's not here, I wish he was, so I could ask him this. We were also asked about queue jumping. And we found this to be queue jumping by asylum seekers. So we found this to be an erroneous question because there is no queue with respect to making an asylum claim. As many people, or as few people as possible, are welcome to make a claim. There's no line. There's no guarantee you'll get it, but you will have access if you make it to Canadian territory to have your claim heard. Queue jumping is interesting because it's been recently repeated in the BC Court of Appeal. Sean Rehag has talked about this. And so it's coming up in refugee-related discourse, and we should be a little bit unsettled by that because ultimately it's erroneous in law, so I think we need to pay attention to that. Finally, a methodological concern. Existing federal data, this is a heavy slide, so I'll try to just run through it quickly, wants to compare government-assisted refugees with privately assisted refugees and landed in Canada refugees. So they want to be able to compare them. But as it turns out, in year one, they don't have comparable data. So they have social assistance data, and then they have a GAR, a government-assisted refugee, in year one gets federal assistance for 1 year. Income assistance, it's called. And remember, GARs have a special situation. They have to repay their flights for their entire family. They have to repay them. In year one, there's no charge to that loan, but as time goes on, they have to pay interest. So there are tiny bits of extra money in there, nothing much more than a social assistance rate. But that is an amount paid for by the federal government called income assistance. It is not social assistance. Refugees are actually told in the camps before they come that they will have a chance to learn English or French and study, and there will be a basic stipend, that they are expected to work, but it is not quite the same as for a privately sponsored refugee or someone who makes a claim and arrives here. So what happens when you use proxy data? So this is data showing income assistance provided by the federal government, not social assistance provided by the provincial government. In year one, it shows that 70% of GARs use income assistance. And so this is incorrect. Statistically, it's incorrect. When I brought this up, I was told, well, they need this as a proxy. It's the best that we have. And I actually refused to accept that because it has the effect of stigmatizing this group as hard to settle and potentially having an adverse effect on public policy.